Before we dive in, I need to make something crystal clear. I'm not a licensed psychologist, criminologist, or forensic professional. This podcast is based on research, documented cases, and our own personal interest in true crime. Our goal is to inform, analyze, and discuss. It's not to diagnose or provide professional advice. If you're looking for clinical expertise, please consult licensed professionals. Welcome back to Mark for Evidence with Zuska and Luna. If you've been following along, you know we've started to dig into what makes a serial killer and how the very first kill often leaves red flags waving in the air. But today, we're going deeper. We'll explore the brain, the impact of trauma, and how early experiences combined with biology can shape behavior. We're stepping inside the criminal mind. What actually goes on in the brain of someone who kills again and again? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Trauma, wiring, or all of the above? Let's crack open the psychology of serial killers and attempt to figure out what drives the worst among us to do what they do. Let's start with the hardware, the brain and what science shows. Scientists studying violent offenders often find the same brain regions lighting up, or rather failing to light up. Multiple studies of serial killers' brains reveal abnormalities in regions linked to empathy, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Reduced activity in these areas can help explain why some killers show little remorse, can't regulate urges, and lack normal fear responses. But here's the important part. Brain scans don't predict murder. They highlight vulnerabilities, not destiny. Plenty of people have underactive amygdalas and never go on to harm anyone. Wiring does matter, but it's certainly not the whole story. Another layer researchers are paying close attention to is head trauma. In fact, studies suggest that nearly 80% of high-profile serial killers suffered significant head injuries earlier in life. These injuries can impair impulse control, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Trauma to the mind isn't always just emotional. It can be physical. Richard Ramirez was struck in the head multiple times as a child, once knocked unconscious by a swing. John Wayne Gacy suffered blackouts from a playground head injury and later endured a skull fracture as a teenager. When head injuries collide with childhood abuse or neglect, it can form a dangerous mix of vulnerability and vitality. The prefrontal cortex, which helps us weigh consequences, may be compromised. The amygdala, regulating fear and aggression, often underperforms. But it's not just about these areas. Researchers now examine the broader neuromoral circuit, a network of brain regions that govern empathy, moral reasoning, and emotional processing. Yet not every traumatized child becomes a killer. Many killers were once children who endured violence so deep it carved out their capacity for empathy. Instead of turning inward to heal, they turned outward, and the cycle of pain spread. A study from the University of Chicago examined the brains of over 800 incarcerated men and found that individuals who committed or attempted homicide had often reduced gray matter compared to those involved in other offenses. This suggests differences in how they process empathy and morality. Here's a quote from a testimony from court. In brain scans of violent offenders, we consistently see underactivation in the amygdala. This doesn't mean someone will kill, but it does create an environment where fear responses are blunted and empathy doesn't register the way it does for you and me. If the brain lays the foundation, trauma often builds the house. Childhood trauma shows up again and again in the backgrounds of many convicted serial killers, from abuse, neglect, abandonment, and exposure to violence. These wounds repeat across case files. Childhood trauma is the reoccurring ghost in the story of serial killers. For example, Ted Bundy grew up under instability and family secrecy. He was raised believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. His mother, Eleanor, gave birth to him out of wedlock in 1946, and the family invented this story to avoid the social stigma. Eileen Wuornos' childhood was marked by the cycle of abandonment, severe abuse, and neglect that profoundly impacted her life later. After being abandoned by her mother, she was raised by her grandparents in a chaotic and violent home environment. Richard Ramirez's father, Julian Ramirez, was a former police officer with an explosive temper. He would regularly beat Richard and his siblings, sometimes with an iron rod, and would lock them in the basement for hours or days. Ramirez reportedly began sleeping in a local cemetery as a preteen to escape the abuse. At 13, he was present when his cousin shot and killed his wife. He later returned to the crime scene with his father to help collect his cousin's belongings and was struck by the gory atmosphere. Here's some quotes from a courtroom testimony. Prosecutor: Mr. Ramirez, when did you first see violence? Ramirez: when I was a kid, my cousin showed me pictures. People with their heads blown off in Vietnam. I was 10. He laughed. I laughed too. Guess it stuck. Again, not every traumatized child becomes a killer. But many serial killers were severely hurt kids who never healed. Instead, they turned their pain outward into obsession, violence, and ultimately fatalities.
We've seen how the brain and early experiences create vulnerability. The next layer is psychological. Dangerous fantasies that take root and guide actions. Killers often spend years in their imagination before acting. Power, control, revenge, it starts as daydreams, then becomes obsession. Fantasy is a fuel. It often starts small, with dreams of domination or vengeance, but over time, these fantasies grow darker, more detailed, and more violent. For example, Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, journaled his bondage fantasies decades before his first murder. His fantasies progressed from childhood animal cruelty, obsessive thoughts, to actually stalking and rehearsing his sadistic rituals. He later described his escalating fantasies as a, quote, picture show in his mind that he felt compelled to make real. Jeffrey Dahmer admitted his fantasies of control consumed him long before he killed. His violent sexual fantasies evolved over years, starting with a childhood fascination with dead animals, and it progressed into a compulsion for total domination over a love slave. He was fueled by deep-seated loneliness, social isolation, and a fear of abandonment. Here's a quote from the interrogation of Dahmer. Detective: so you're telling me you thought about it before you did it? Dahmer: thought about it all the time. Every night. The fantasy wasn't enough anymore. I had to make it real. Now, Ed Kemper described imagining domination and murder as a teenager, long before acting out his crimes. His violent fantasies were rooted in a childhood of severe emotional abuse, primarily at the hands of his domineering and belittling mother. And over time, his fantasies, they escalated from imaginary games to animal cruelty and eventually to murder. Serial killers aren't just chasing blood. Many are chasing control. Some pose bodies. Others keep trophies like jewelry or maybe locks of hair and photographs. And many will revisit the crime scenes to relive the moment. It's not just murder. It becomes ritual. The act itself becomes part of their identity. Here's another quote from the courtroom in the BTK trial. Rader says, quote, "I had to do it my way. Bind them, torture them, kill them. Then I'd keep something to remember because that made it real." Now, this obsession is why law enforcement studies signatures, the personal rituals that go beyond the practical how to reveal the psychological why. Brief involuntary facial expressions or micro expressions, they can often reveal hidden emotions or deception in high-stakes situations like interrogations. Now, fantasy and sexual obsession, they often overlap. Many serial killers display paraphilias like abnormal fixations, such as voyeurism, sadism, or necrophilia that fuse with violent fantasy. And once that fantasy is no longer enough, escalation sure to follow. So, big question, are the serial killers made or born? And the truth is, usually both. There is no single serial killer gene, but genetic predispositions such as tendencies towards psychopathy or impulsion, they can create a foundation. Pair that with trauma, neglect, or social isolation, and you have a lethal combination. In neurocriminology, a field that actually blends the brain science and criminology, experts examine the neuromoral circuit, linking empathy, moral reasoning, and emotional regulation. When disrupted by genetics, injury, or trauma, this circuit can affect impulse control, empathy, and moral decision-making. Biology may load the gun, trauma pulls the trigger, and opportunity allows it to fire. It's not fate. It's a toxic storm of colliding factors. Understanding why someone kills is only part of the story. Forensic science gives investigators the tools to reconstruct crime and uncover the truth. Body farms study donated human bodies in different environments in order to understand decomposition in real time. This research helps investigators determine the time of death, track decomposition patterns, and identify hidden graves. These sites are not about glorifying death. They actually can provide the needed knowledge that closes cases, that delivers answers to families, and potentially maybe prevent killers from hiding in plain sight. Modern body farms are high-tech labs, and researchers use 3D imaging and artificial intelligence to capture precise decomposition data. Scientists also study the necrobiome, the microbial communities that form after death. Around 48 hours post-mortem, consistent microbial shifts can help investigators determine time of death with remarkable precision. And if you're listening from Texas, this research is actually happening locally. The Forensic Anthropology Center at Texas State is now the largest body farm in the world, with 26 acres that are dedicated to studying human decomposition. Here's a quote from expert testimony. The forensic scientist, quote, "Every stage of decomposition tells us a story. The insects, the soil, the weathering. It all helps establish when death occurred. In homicide cases, narrowing that timeline can make or break the investigation." It's not just technology or psychology. Sometimes nature itself testifies. Forensic botanists use tiny plant fragments, pollen, and environmental DNA to link suspects to crime scenes. In one case, oak leaves found in a car trunk became the silent witness that helped convict a killer. Even the landscape holds memory, and investigators, they're learning to listen. Understanding why someone kills does not excuse it, but it does give insight. Serial killers aren't explained by a single factor. Trauma, fantasy, power, and biology, they all intertwine in very chilling ways. Insight can prevent tragedy, catch offenders faster, and perhaps break cycles of violence. And in the next episode, we're going to dive into how science can trap the guilty, from old school behavioral profiling down to high-tech digital footprints. Until then, remember, don't be afraid of the dark. Be curious about it. Thank you for joining us on Marked for Evidence with Zuska and Moment in Crime with Luna. We're glad you're here with us in the shadows. If you've liked today's episode, follow us, leave a review, and share this podcast with someone who won't mind a little criminal psychology over coffee or tea. Stay sharp, stay safe, and stay curious.